is an Avro Lancaster, the supreme British heavy bomber of the Second World War. Over 7,000 of these aircraft were built, and with their 4 mighty Merlin engines, they could deliver huge payloads of bombs to strike deep into the heart of Nazi Germany. By the autumn of 1944, the Allies had pushed deep into Western Europe. But as they entered Belgium and Holland, the offensive ground to a halt. Their supply lines were growing too long. German supply lines were shortening as they fell back towards Germany. As long as the Germans could resupply their front line, there was no immediate end to the war in sight. So the Allies had to destroy German war equipment before it reached the front line. And to do this, they had to strike at Germany's traditional industrial heartland, the Ruhr Valley, places such as Essen. This is the Ruhr Valley, home to Germany's heavy industry. Since May 1940, the Ruhr had been a prime target for Allied bombers. But despite hundreds of raids, the factories continued to mass produce weapons of war. The centre of this giant war machine was the Krupp's arms factory in Essen. For over 4 centuries, the Krupp family dynasty had made arms and armour here. They had 6 million square yards of factory space. There were warehouses, steel mills and smokestacks everywhere. In a year, at full tilt, Krupps could produce 20 million metric tons of shells, guns and tanks. The Krupp's arms factories had to be destroyed. For 4 years, the Allies had been trying to do just that. But Essen was one of the most heavily defended cities in all of Europe. German fighter squadrons stalked the Allied bombers in the air. From the ground, thousands of anti-aircraft guns filled the sky with flak. This barrage was so deadly that the air crews called the Ruhr Flak Alley. Weapons like this 88mm flak gun lined the Ruhr Valley. Effective up to around 25,000 feet, they fired shells with an altitude fuse that exploded in the sky, sending tons of metal into the air. The Allied bomber crews flew at around 20,000 feet, making them extremely vulnerable to these weapons. The Krupp's factory in Essen was surrounded by this deadly flak storm.
If there was one place we didn't want to go, it was Essen, because the defences there, the flak, the ack guns, you had to be in among it to know what it was really like.
19-year-old Charles Harold flew regular missions to Essen as a navigator with 35 Squadron.
We had most definitely our worst night ever on Essen. We got caught in searchlights. The attack on us was absolutely terrifying. It was Our skipper was in a state of real fear. I mean, it was absolutely awful. So close, there was stuff coming through the actual fuselage of the machine, coming through and dropping on the floor alongside us. You know, I mean, I know it sounds almost like fiction, but that's how it was. How we got out of that, I'll never know.
To make matters worse, Essen was often shrouded in a thick haze of industrial smog, making targets very difficult to identify from the air.
I think I only ever saw a target twice. Imagine all those times. I only saw it twice, because what I saw was clouds of fog and smoke. And I never actually was able to pick anything out. That's how bad it was.
At the start of the air war, only about 3 out of 10 bombers got within 5 miles of their target. So the British developed a radar navigation system that enabled them to strike targets even when they couldn't see them. It was called OBO. OBO consisted of 2 tracking beams broadcast from radar stations in the UK. Those here in Norfolk were known as the CAT stations. Those in Kent were known as Mouse. The CAT stations were designed to keep the aircraft on course. If a plane strayed too far this way, you'd hear a series of dots, like Morse code. If it strayed too far this way, a series of dashes. It was only when he was directly on course that they'd hear a single continuous beam, like the sound of an oboe. Once over the target, this is where Mouse came in. The pilot would listen out for the Mouse signal, the bomb release signal. When he heard this, 5 dots and a dash, it was bombs away. In October '43, Charles Harrold joined an elite squadron of Mosquito fighter bombers, equipped with oboe technology. The Pathfinders flew ahead of the main bomber stream. Their job was to drop high visibility flares onto the target to guide in the heavy bombers.
If you came out of the target and banked and looked over like that, you could see them burst in the sky. They burst about 1,500 feet above the ground, and they dropped like great coloured candles onto the target. Beautiful colours, reds, yellows, silver, absolutely. The Germans on the ground, when they saw them coming down, called them Christmas trees. How ironic can you get?
How ironic, considering the presents on their way.
That's right.
These target markers hung in the sky for a long time and allowed the bombers following up behind to release their bombs right on the marked out target area.
16-year-old Werner Schaumann was a gun loader with a 20mm flak battery in Essen.
Most of the attacks were by the British and took place at night, launched from a height of about 8,000 metres. There could be 200 or 300 or 400 planes carrying out the attack, and each one lasted for about 45 minutes. Then the planes would turn around, but invariably the factories would carry on working.
Despite their advanced technology and the impact of thousands of tons of bombs, Allied bombing strategy simply wasn't working. As soon as the bombers turned for home, the Germans set about making good the damage done. Repair crews and new equipment were sent to the factory floor. Production lines were very rarely completely stopped. In fact, despite the bombing, the Germans were able to increase their military output. By using slave labour and dispersing their factories, output increased. At the end of 1943, for instance, the Germans were producing about 1,000 tanks a month. A year later, this had gone up to 1,800 tanks a month. Commander-in-Chief of RAF Bomber Command, Arthur Bomber Harris, was determined to knock out the Krupp's factories once and for all. His plan was quite simple: to attack with greater numbers of bombers than ever before. On Monday, the 23rd of October, 1944, a huge force of Lancasters Halifax's a Mosquitoes was prepared for the treacherous journey into Germany. At 4 p.m, the Pathfinders set off ahead of the main bomber fleet. The stage was set for the big boys of Bomber Command. That night, 1,000 heavy bombers followed the Pathfinders into Essen. They brought with them more than 4,500 tons of incendiary and high explosive bombs. It was by far the largest raid the RAF had ever undertaken. RAF Bomber Command's priority was strategic bombing, the destruction of German industry, bombing German cities. To help with the invasion of Europe, they'd been taken off these missions, but with the advance into Northern Europe well underway, Harris's men were able to return to their original job. So, in October of 1944, a huge raid was planned against Essen, here, home to the massive Krupp's armament factories. In south and eastern England, over 1,000 aircraft were prepared for the perilous journey into Germany. Leading the British attack on Essen would be the Avro Lancaster bomber. (7,337 Lancaster bombers were built during the Second World War, but very few remain today. This is Just Jane, and she's one of only 4 surviving Lancasters in the UK. This is the business end of the Lancaster, the Bomb Bay. It's a multi-purpose weapon delivery system. It could be packed full of 100-pound anti-submarine bombs or carry one gigantic Grand Slam bomb, which weighed 10 tons. Crammed into the nose of the Lancaster was the bomb aimer. His job was to hit the target accurately. To do this, he wouldn't actually release the bombs when he was over the target. He had to release them a couple of miles beforehand, so their forward motion would carry them onto the target accurately. He also had the only escape hatch in the Lancaster, underneath him, here. A crew of 7 worked inside the Lancaster. But of all the jobs, the rear gunners was probably the most dangerous. Tail end Charlie's job was simple enough. He was to look out for enemy fighters and shoot them down before they could attack the Lancaster. It would have been very, very cold in here and very isolated. The aircraft flew under radio silence, but the radio operator's job was to listen out for enemy transmissions, jam enemy signals, and make sure there were no enemy aircraft homing in on the Lancaster's position. This is the cockpit of the Lancaster bomber. I'm sitting in the pilot's seat. The pilot's job, of course, was to fly the aircraft, to maintain its height, its speed, its direction. Behind him sat the navigator. His job was to tell the pilot where to go. To his right sat the flight engineer. He would monitor the aircraft systems. These dials are for the engines. If anything happened to the pilot, the flight engineer was to take over. But of all these men, the pilot was the most important, and that's why he was the only one with an armoured seat.
It was essentially a team operation. 7 guys together in a metal tube, 69 feet long and 6 feet wide.
In 1944, 24-year-old Jack Harris couldn't drive a car, but he could pilot a Lancaster bomber, flying 37 missions with 550 Squadron.
We used to fly in a bomber stream, putting perhaps 30 bombers a minute over the target. So the air was pretty congested. And one of your worries was the collision risk, colliding with other Lancasters or Halifaxes in the bomber stream. When you got over the target, there was another risk of possibly being hit by bombs or incendiaries dropped from aircraft above you. There wasn't too much you could do about that, but the risk was there.
Jack also had to avoid the packs of German night fighters that hunted the Allied bombers.
If you saw the night fighter approaching, you went into a diving turn, 60 degrees bank, and slipped off about 2,000 feet, and you went the other way into a climbing turn and climbed up about 3,000 feet, and then came back the other side. It's just like a corkscrew. Some pretty violent manoeuvring with perhaps 60 degrees of bank each time, each way.
Inside the bomber stream you'd be doing this?
You'd be doing this inside the bomber stream, which was not a recommended practice, but you had to do it to avoid the night fighters. Yes, yes.
Goodness me. This is the first time Jack has been back on board a Lancaster for 60 years.
Big engine run, yeah. Oh,
fabulous.
Steady. That's great.
So how is it to be back in the aircraft after 60 years?
60 years slipped away in a flash. To hear those Merlins purring away and to see those 4 propellers turning and see the instruments dancing on the instrument panel, absolutely wonderful, you know. There's nothing better. Really tremendous recollection, that is.
Fantastic. On the afternoon of the 23rd of October 1944, Jack's crew took off from an airfield in Lincolnshire. His was one of 1,055 bombers en route to Essen to bomb the Krupp's arms factory. It was the biggest raid the RAF had ever undertaken. This is Jack's log for that 5.5-hour mission.
There was an awful lot of cloud, up to 10 or 12,000 feet. And when we were climbing up through this cloud, we encountered very heavy icing. I remember the ice coming off the propellers and wanging into the fuselage, which is a slightly alarming sound. Fortunately, we managed to climb up fairly quickly and got clear of it.
The bad weather did have one advantage. The thick cloud cover protected the bomber stream from the eyes of the flak gunners 20,000 feet below.
The flak was about average, not intense. There were some night fighters about, but we actually didn't see any really, it was what you would call a routine trip.
For those on the ground, it would be anything but routine. Each Lancaster was carrying 15,000 pounds of bombs.
My aircraft was loaded with one 4,000-pound bomb, which we called the Cookie, and the rest were incendiaries. And the purpose of the Cookie, which had huge blast effects, was to knock down walls and lift roofs and break windows, and then the incendiaries would come along and start the fires going and complete the destruction.
At 7:30, the first bombs were dropped. 4,500 tons of explosive fell on Essen that night. The raids completely destroyed 8 armour plate mills, 7 machine shops and 6 steel foundries. Railway yards, storage facilities and warehouses were flattened. The Krupp's company archive refers to an almost complete breakdown in the electrical supply network and a paralysis in production. As an arms manufacturer, Krupp's was on its last legs. Of the 1,055 bombers that attacked Essen, only 8 failed to return home. All across Germany, highly orchestrated heavy bombing raids delivered more and more bombs onto more and more targets. The Third Reich was on its knees. By the beginning of 1945, the country's infrastructure was beginning to fall apart. Railway lines were clogged, roads were full of burned-out vehicles, gas, water and electricity supplies were ruined. Despite all of its efforts, German industry had been strangled. The hardware it produced had no fuel to run on and nowhere to go. The Allied bombing raids were succeeding in starving the German front lines. But Hitler wasn't beaten yet.